The Legend of the Apartment Invaded. Written by Angela Riteman. 5th audiobook edition. This audiobook includes an extra story, Praise, written by Anthony R. Wilbourne. This book is a work of fiction. All characters, locales, and events contained herein are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance or reference to an actual person, property, locale, or so forth, either existing or not, is strictly coincidental if not confidential. The Legend of the Apartment Invaded. Suze returned home very late. Let's just say around midnight. Her next-door neighbor was being annoying. He had his stereo up crazy loud. He was throwing a wild party. Suze grabbed the doorknob. It seemed to dance to the beat of the music. While inserting her key, she mumbled, "God damn it." She lazily unlocked the door and entered her apartment. The lights were off. The lamps and moon outside illuminated the space only slightly. She flipped a switch, turning a light on. The living room had a couch, shelf, analog TV, and 2 tables. The unit was surrounded by white bricks. Like a jail cell. The noise seemed louder from inside. She could clearly hear singing, talking, and of course thumping. Pissed, she slammed the door, hoping to give the jerk a taste of his own medicine, but it didn't work. The noise stayed the same. For Suze, this was going to be another night of serious torture. Suze had been coming home to this pretty much every night. It was like living in a cardboard box that everybody trampled on. A storm waiting to happen. Even when it got quiet, she thought she heard things that weren't actually there. She complained to the manager many times. Others probably complained too. Apparently, it did no good because the guy was still next door. Suze yawned and thought, I need to relax. I think I'll start by getting something to eat. She removed her coat and hung it on one of those old-fashioned vertical coat racks, tossed her purse and keys onto the couch, and stretched out a bit. She walked to the kitchen and opened the fridge. Its bright light revealed her to be a plain-looking girl in her, mid-20s with pale skin and stringy hair. Her shirt and jeans were worn and faded from months of wears and washes. She didn't appear to be a person of much circumstance. The people of her apartment complex, including the manager, probably weren't of much circumstance either. I've heard people say that Suze's story is based on an actual event. An incident that occurred in the neighborhood just north of Bridge Street. You know, over where they built the new shopping district. In a city to the east, which had been growing significantly ever since the economy began prospering. But back to the kitchen. Suze grabbed a block of cheese, packet of ham, and jug of milk. After setting the food on a counter, she reached for a cupboard and grabbed a loaf of bread. Upon opening another cupboard, she noticed that one of her drinking glasses was turned right side up. This was weird because Suze never set her cups right side up. She didn't like the thought of dust falling into them and accidentally drinking something nasty. Oh well, Suze thought. Maybe I forgot to set it right. This constant commotion's been making me forget all kinds of things. With a knife pulled from a drawer, she cut a slice of cheese. The ham was already cut. She fixed the sandwich and poured the milk into a glass that wasn't turned right side up. She took her meal to the couch. Suze switched on the TV and played a DVD she had watched yesterday. Having turned the volume up just enough to drown out the noise, she slumped against the cushions and unwound. At about 1 a.m., she began passing out. I think I've heard this before. Suddenly, something awakened her. Not the TV, but a single thump from somewhere in the back of the apartment. The noise from next door had stopped. Suze switched the TV off, got up and shambled into the narrow hallway between the bedroom and bathroom. She had consumed only half of her meal. Suze turned to the bathroom whose door was ajar. She cautiously hit the light and peeked inside. A sink, hanging towel, and small toilet lay in the door's periphery. She listened for a moment. Hearing nothing, she pushed the door wide open, seeing a dirty tub and shower curtain. The curtain was drawn and the tub was empty. Next was the bedroom. Its door was ajar too. Without peeking inside first, Suze pushed the door aside and hit the light. She saw nothing unusual. Her room looked just as it did earlier that day. The bed, which was actually a couple of air mattresses, was unmade, clothes were on the floor and the slider door was closed. Even the slider's blinds looked undisturbed. Suze thought about checking the closet, but it also appeared no different. It was still filled with clothes and boxes. Feeling better and very tired, she plopped onto her bed and went to sleep, but her rest didn't last long. After only an hour or so, she was awakened by more noise. The party had gotten louder. This was the last straw. Suze stormed outside and knocked on her neighbor's door. Weakly at first. Then, after no response, more strongly. Somebody behind the door seemed to be laughing at her. Desperate, she ran to the phone inside her apartment and called the police. She then turned off all the lights and waited in the living room, looking out its window every couple of minutes. At about 3, Suze saw 2 police officers knock the neighbor's door. Somebody answered but didn't step outside. She couldn't make out the conversation, so she tried to guess by reading the officers' lips. Unable to lip read, she tried to read their body language. One of the officers rested a hand on his holster, much to her shock. After about 10 minutes, they walked away and the noise stopped. Suze had won the fight and decided to celebrate with a nice hot shower. She closed the door, removed her clothes and started the water. She let it fall onto her chin and then onto her back. The pressure was relaxing. Like a massage. The steam created the illusion of a sauna. The blurry white tiles of the tub area helped her zone out. The splashing deafened her from everything outside the bathroom. After nearly passing out from total relaxation, she drenched her face, stopped the shower head and toweled off. Suze returned to the living room. Everything was nice and quiet now. There seemed to be no sign of life except her own. Looking back, she felt kind of bad about calling the police. She hated confrontation and naturally feared the things people might do when provoked. The world's rich in psychos. For all Suze knew, her neighbor could be one of them. She hadn't met him. If she had, she probably could have gotten to know him. Reasoned with him. Maybe even been invited to the party. She recalled seeing the noisy neighbor once. Through her window, she saw him and some girl walk out and back into the apartment. She also recalled boxes, which were either in their hands or at their feet. Suze put her ear against the wall between hers and the neighbor's apartments. She listened carefully, trying to hear if anything was still going on. Nothing was going on. There was no music. No friends. No life. She raised her head, smiled and drifted to her bedroom. Once inside, Suze dropped the towel she wore around her torso, lifted the blanket, and slid into bed, having neglected to hit the light like she had before taking her shower. As she lay on her side, she looked out the slider window. Through the gaps between blinds, she saw a parking lot, street and cars that passed by at irregular intervals. She counted the cars' headlights as if they were sheep. After the 3rd or 4th sheep, a thin layer of something white covered her eyes. It wasn't until she started hyperventilating that she realized it was a plastic bag. She couldn't breathe. She struggled and struggled, trying to rip the sack open, but whoever held it tightly. Upon touching the stranger's hands, she found that it was a man, suffocating her. She desperately tried to see if it was her neighbor, exacting his revenge, but the freak kept pushing her head down. She cried and tried to say that she was sorry, but it was no use. She stopped breathing. If Suze had been able to turn her head, she would have seen that the killer was her apartment manager. And if she had been able to enter her neighbor's apartment, she would have found nothing but a few plastic bags and a stereo. Praise. Shiloh was seeking a Wi-Fi connection when he met Arnie. While looking up from his phone, Shiloh observed the young unkempt man pulling blades of grass out with one hand and holding a rolled-up cigarette with the other. Only an inch of the cigarette was left. Its flame was alarmingly close to Arnie's fingers. Fingers whose tips were burnt a reddish black. Shoulder-length hair hung over his face, which was unshaven and seemingly defiled by the sun. His shirt was dirty and his jeans were threadbare. Shiloh had seen Arnie several times before. Each time, the man was in a different part of the city, once sitting, sometimes smoking, and always alone. During at least one of the sightings, he felt as though Arnie had seen him also. That time Shiloh said hi. He had grown depressed since losing his home, and the long, lonely walks around the city were getting monotonous. He wanted some company. Something to take his mind off the stares, snickers, and offers of people more fortunate. Shiloh was surprised how well he and Arnie hit it off. After an hour, Arnie became very communicative. Shiloh learned that the man had been in this city for 3 days. He left the shelter at which he stayed and hitched a train until he wound up here. Empathetic, Shiloh introduced Arnie to his shelter. The Betts Street shelter, at which Shiloh had been crashing for over a month, granted Arnie a bed for 14 days. The 14-day rule wasn't absolute. At the shelter manager's discretion, a guest could stay for longer without having to pay the daily rent of $3. Nobody seemed to know what criteria the manager used in granting a free rent extension. His decision would seem more personal than anything, so most guests would do their best to be nice, obedient, and silent. Shiloh was granted the extension only once. Since then, he had been paying the rent. Another one of the Betts Street shelter's rules was that guests weren't allowed to remain on the premises during the day. From 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day, the staff cleaned the grounds, mopped the showers, prepared dinner, and organized events with the shelter's sponsor, Purple Dawn Church. Shiloh spent his mornings as productively as he could. On days he didn't work, he typically walked 5 miles to the nearest library and used its computers to search for jobs. He could have used his own computer, a laptop, to do this, but sitting inside someplace was better than sitting outside, and the library provided outlets from which he could charge his computer and phone. He wasn't comfortable charging the devices at the shelter because guests would have their stuff stolen from time to time, which was why he kept the laptop, along with a bunch of other valuable possessions, hidden in his backpack and often secured in a closet provided by staff. Almost immediately, Arnie began accompanying Shiloh to the library. Although Arnie didn't look for work, he did look for books. Occasionally, he emulated Shiloh's behavior of checking out a book for something to read before lights out. On days Shiloh did work, he woke up at 4 in the morning, swiftly dressing and freshening up, so he could catch the van to the day labor facility downtown. His extension was about to end, and needed money to start meeting his rental obligation. The driver, with the help of the shelter manager who would kick a guest out if they made too much noise that early, wouldn't accept more than 7 people, so it was critical that Shiloh complete his routine quickly and quietly. The day labor facility was a challenge too. Countless individuals would eagerly wait for the lady behind the check-in window to call their names. Sometimes an individual would get picked. Sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes, Shiloh, after waiting several hours, walked all the way back to the shelter empty-handed because the return van had already left. When he was picked for a job, he usually lifted heavy cabinets into buildings that were under construction. He didn't mind the task too much. It was simple, and the people with whom he worked were bearable. Still, he wished Arnie would have joined him in the travail. Shiloh and Arnie had become friends since bumping into each other 3 weeks ago. Arnie was 5 feet 4 inches and easygoing despite mistakes he admittedly committed in the past, especially toward his son. He shared his interests and listened with due regard to Shiloh's complaints about the shelter and visions of working in advertising, buying a house, and raising a family. This wasn't always the case with others in the shelter. Shiloh felt that there was often an air of opportunity, a fear of his words reaching the ears of somebody looking to capitalize on them. Arnie didn't seem like that. He seemed to have chosen Betts Street for protection, not benefit. That is, until last week. While on a trip to a store, he told Shiloh that he had been thinking about trying Purple Dawn's rehabilitation program. According to the shelter manager, they would provide him with a private room, amenities, and caseworker. Shiloh didn't know how to respond. He liked Arnie's initiative, but not his choice. Shiloh got creeped out when visiting the church because there seemed to be a pressure to conform. Every so often, he caught somebody watch him or whisper something to somebody else when he or another person didn't smile, clap, or raise their hands like many others. After a moment of silence, however, Shiloh suggested that Arnie act on his decision. Maybe the structure of the church would be good for the Faye former father. Shiloh's presence alone seemed to have been minimizing his smoking. His fingers were healing. Maybe they would heal the rest of him. Besides, he, unlike Shiloh, didn't have a family to fall back on. Arnie and Shiloh's last moments together came only a few days ago. Shiloh's thoughts of Arnie were shattered by the yelling of Cedric, the burly, ponytailed shelter manager. He was ordering everybody to form a line onto the faded decommissioned school bus that rested off the property. Tonight was Friday, the night on which everybody with a bed was required to attend worship with Pastor Kenneth Please. Shiloh remained still, holding a foam cup of water. He watched all the guests herd forward while Cedric directed their movements. Another staff member rounded up a few stragglers from inside the shelter. From somewhere in the crowd, a boss surfaced. Some giggles followed. Cedric, not looking the least bit amused, turned to pinpoint the joker. He couldn't find him any more than Shiloh could. That's when the burly mustachioed man with the short ponytail shouted, "Hey, get up! It's time to go." Cedric watched Shiloh arise, using his fist for propulsion against the log on which he sat. Shiloh wore a large t-shirt, dark shorts, and decorative bandana over his brow. His hair was thick and tousled. He looked 20 or so. He smiled reproachfully, took a drink, stuffed the cup in a side pocket, and stepped in line. Cedric closed in from behind. The bus en route to the church was filled with a thunderous exhilaration in which Shiloh just couldn't engage. Although it was nice to do something other than eat, sleep, or walk, he remembered how much nicer it was to do these things in his own home and on his own time. He looked past the talking heads and through the rusty windows. He saw the lights, the restaurants, the cars, the lovers, friends, and children who occupied the world outside, free to come and go as they pleased. He wondered if any of them were travelers as well. 3 years ago, Shiloh had become a student of Wilbourne College, a private for-profit institution in a city not too far from the one he currently inhabited. He was studying advertising marketing while living in an apartment subsidized by the school. Shiloh left his home state to attend Wilbourne for 4 reasons: the college's stirring promotion, its unique financial aid program, proximity to advertising opportunities, and a basic young person's desire to explore new terrain. One day, however, Wilbourne closed its doors and Shiloh had to sever his subsidized housing contract. He had saved enough money to lease an apartment in his own name, but after a year of security deposits, higher living costs, and income loss between jobs, Shiloh found himself 2 months behind on rent and with little hope of catching up. He thought about attending a local community college in the fall. He asked his parents for help to stay in the city, but they were having financial problems too. They advised their son to make some kind of arrangement with his landlord, but that didn't work either. So Shiloh informed the landlord of his vacation, gathered some clothes and valuable possessions, and began riding his bicycle back to his family, approximately 800 miles away. He would deal with settling the back rent when he got home. He knew he wouldn't make it back in just a few days. Probably not even in a couple of weeks. He'd have to spend some nights on the streets, maybe even in shelters. He'd have to ration the sandwiches he packed and what little money he had. He figured that, if he cycled all morning, afternoon, and evening, he could clear up to 100 miles a day. It was July, and the usual temperatures in the states he'd pass through were 90 degrees at day and 50 degrees at night. On day 1 of his journey, Shiloh cleared 40 miles in 8 hours. Unfortunately, the inner tubes of his bicycle deflated, and because he had no air pump, was left stranded. While crouched on a stoop feeling helpless, a middle-aged man passing by spotted him. Similar to how Shiloh led Arnie, the man led Shiloh to the shelter on Betts Street. Shiloh abandoned his bicycle. "I wonder whatever happened to that guy," Shiloh thought as Cedric ordered everybody off the bus. Upon exiting, Shiloh saw the church, which was actually a hotel. A 4-story hotel that at one time might have been grand, but now appeared crude and grotty. While most of the guests, having simmered down from their bout of excitement, followed Cedric to the building, others remained in the parking lot. The pink-skinned, popcorn-haired, straggler-rounding staffer turned to the others and reminded them that services would start in 20 minutes. He ran to catch up with the rest of the group as the bus rolled away. Shiloh started ambling, his hands in his pockets. Wishing he could crush the cup, he dumped on the floor of the bus even more. He wasn't looking forward to another 2 hours of preachy condescension. He didn't want to hear, again, how there was a reason for his plight. So he joined the other group, which had started talking. Some minutes later, Shiloh asked Carlos, a slow-moving man who resembled an olive-skinned, slack-jowled Jeff Bezos with a cane and glasses, what he knew about the shelter's rehabilitation program. Carlos drew on his cigar, blew, and said, "I know it's run by Purple Dawn Church. The same church that owns this building." Shiloh stood attentively, trying to evade the smoke by breathing shallowly. He continued, turning to the hotel. They bought the place and turned it into a temporary home for people looking to re-enter society. How do they re-enter society? Shiloh replied politely. Do they receive job training? Counseling? A bit of both, I guess. The church might have them do odd jobs within the hotel, or somebody inside might get them a job outside. I'm almost certain that's the case because somebody once told me that they saw someone from our shelter working with a road crew downtown. And the counseling? I don't see why they wouldn't get that. I'm sure somebody in the church has those credentials. In his time at Betts Street, Carlos had seen some of the hotel's occupants, but hadn't talked to them. They were always somewhere far away or high above. Their appearances, quite sporadic. Their butts never in worship. What about the rehabilitation program? Shiloh asked. Where's that held? Don't know. Purple Dawn owns so many buildings in this city, and goes by so many different names, that it could be anywhere. It certainly could have been. Guests didn't seem to know what life was like for somebody who moved into rehabilitation or some other program, for the transfers never returned to the shelter. It wasn't a subject staff talked about, nor was it something one, if they favored their bed, inquired about. After a pause, Carlos said, "How's the job hunt going? Snag anything yet?" A bicycle, which rested on a property next door, had entered Shiloh's purview. It looked so tempting, parked there all alone. He considered stealing it until he noticed the hooked palisade fence that separated the lot on which he stood from the mobile park on which the bike stood. What's this place doing to me? Oh, Shiloh said, snapping back into the conversation, no. The place I applied to hasn't gotten back to me. Last week, after Arnie made his announcement, Shiloh entered a nearby McDonald's to inquire about the now hiring text on the restaurant's reader board. A female manager recommended that he submit an application online. He did so while at the library the next day. Because he couldn't receive calls on his phone, he used the shelter's phone as a contact number. He also left a note, asking her to email him if he couldn't answer her call. Maybe they never will, Shiloh resumed grimly. Carlos took another, longer draw, trying to disguise his pity. He felt sorry for the kid. Carlos wouldn't have wanted to see his own son waste his best years agonizing over things that brought most people pleasure. Suddenly, another guest cut in. His name was Fletch, who resembled nobody in particular. He said to Shiloh, "Hey, if you need money, you could come panhandle with me and a few others tomorrow." Having glanced at Carlos, Shiloh replied, We need somebody to cover a corner in this area." The old guy wussed out. Shiloh wasn't interested for a couple of reasons. For one, he perceived panhandling as one of the worst expressions of desperation. It appeared to be something people with no initiative did to avoid improving their bad situations. For another, Fletch's proposition seemed akin to something like human trafficking. "I'll think it over," Shiloh said hesitantly, respectfully. Carlos drew once more, this time in silent praise. At 5 minutes to 8, Shiloh reached the doorway of the room in which services would take place. The walls were eggshell and filled with interior and exterior shots of a seemingly larger building that Shiloh didn't know. Posters and ornaments of religious figures and symbols filled other spots, mostly those in the front. Stacked chairs, arranged in 5 blocks, filled a floor of hickory felt. They formed a perfect arc, with aisles between the blocks and a podium in the middle, like the seating of a theater house. A piano lay beyond the chairs and against a wall. People occupied the room, half alone, half in small clusters. Based on their untidy appearance, most of the individuals appeared to be shelter guests. The rest, mostly women, were better groomed and better dressed. Shiloh spotted Cedric and several other Bet Street members among a block close to a rack, filled with cards, brochures, and handheld books. He marched to his shelter group, maneuvering through the swaying, jabbering bodies. While doing so, he looked out for the big woman in the fancy dress. During his second week after services had ended, Shiloh had a run-in with a congregant. She had noticed his position in the center block and asked if he was shelter. Shiloh didn't know this woman. She wasn't from Bet Street. She didn't seem to be a guest, because her hair and clothes weren't like those members of the women's shelter typically wore, and her girthy body wasn't of a person under a limited diet. Out of respect, Shiloh admitted he was, but didn't say of which. The woman, perhaps out of pride, proceeded to tell him that he couldn't sit there and was supposed to have sat with others in his group. Who did this woman think she was? The pastor? The shelter manager? Shiloh was angry. He said that nobody had told him about a seating arrangement. The woman said something more. He said something back before sauntering to the exit. As Shiloh left the room, he saw her quietly converse with Pastor Please. Shiloh didn't see the woman but saw Carlos, already seated. He wanted to sit next to the mild-mannered older man, but Carlos had taken the last chair of the third row, so Shiloh selected the far left of 3 empty chairs at the opposite end of the fourth and last row. A minute later, another guest took the right of the 2 remaining chairs, leaving an empty spot between the 2. Another minute later, at precisely 8 p.m., 2 young congregants, a male and female, closed the entrance doors. They moved in front of them and dropped their hands over their laps. Everybody quieted down as the Pastor Please approached the podium. A blank projection screen hung in the back of the platform. Small spotlights hung from above. "Evening, everyone," Please said jovially, his hands resting on a lectern. "Thank you for joining me." Almost everybody in the room responded positively to the pastor's salutation. Most of these guests and congregants smiled while the others beamed. The rest of the people simply simpered. "I realize tonight's a Friday," he continued, "but I feel no night's too good for the Lord's word, just as his word isn't too good for our friends of the shelters." Many attendees nodded in agreement. Among them was Please's wife, who sat in the center block with her son and daughter. Kenneth Please was an average-looking man in his early 30s. He sported an impressive smile and teeth that were not too white, but well-shaped, as if he spent a small fortune on cosmetic dentistry. His outfit wasn't as impressive, however. Even with his dark blazer and crystal-adorned analog watch, an insider or outsider could have mistaken him for a mid-level manager or school teacher. Nevertheless, he stood and spoke confidently. "Tonight I'd like to talk about faith. Specifically, faith in our community." Shiloh searched for a clock, knowing perfectly well he wouldn't find one. This room never had a clock. Knowledge of time was a luxury, not a right, and right now his phone was dead. "Recently, a man came to me with a problem. A man who had grown up in a community unlike our own. A man without God. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, 'Pastor, please, I'm having trouble repenting for what I've done.' Now I know what he's done. He's been punished, reformed, but feels he's still misunderstood by his peers. I've made mistakes too. All of you have probably made mistakes in your lives." Shiloh shifted slightly. As they had before, the pastor's words disconcerted him. They made him wonder if his attempt to run back home was a mistake. No, it wasn't. "I would have been worse off back in the apartment." While looking down, Shiloh noticed the empty seat, realizing how isolated he must have looked. How different he might have appeared to others in the room. But I am different. I don't accept this place as my home. These people probably wouldn't care if this became their last stop in life. He raised his head, momentarily receiving Please's stare. But we learn from them, Please said as he turned to the people ahead. We take punishment like a lesson from a teacher. I'd like to read a verse from Proverbs, chapter 10. It says, "Whoever heeds realizes, discipline shows the way to life, but whoever ignores correction leads others astray." So do you continue living ignorantly, or do you accept the advice of somebody who's not necessarily been where you've been, but has a different perspective? Shiloh wasn't comfortable with this part of the message either. He didn't know what he did to deserve correction. He was going to school and doing his work, just like everybody else around him. It wasn't his fault Colbane closed. This proverb has nothing to do with me. Eventually, the offering plate circulated and the sermon ended. However, instead of asking one of his favorite congregants to step up and sing her song, Please asked Shiloh to meet him at the podium. He, in his rumpled t-shirt and bandana, obliged reluctantly, walking around the front of his block and to the platform. Once there, Please grabbed Shiloh's left shoulder and said, "What's your name, son?" Shiloh immediately turned to the audience. A sea of faces and races lay ahead. The people, older and elderly for the most part, inspected him. Of the 5 blocks, only 2 were primarily occupied by women. The block at the far right appeared to have been the one for the women's shelter. The one at the center contained the better-dressed individuals, and in the front row, a lady holding a toddler and a girl of maybe 7. The toddler had been astoundingly well-behaved. Shiloh, Please cooed. We've seen you around but don't know much about you. How long have you been with us? Shiloh turned back to the pastor before saying, "About?" He couldn't recall. The answer seemed to have left his head. With a twitch he uttered, 2 months. 2 months? Please reiterated. You look awfully young to be out on your own. Yeah. I used to go to school but it closed, so now I'm staying at the shelter until I get back on my feet. Do you have family close by? I do, Shiloh lied, having glimpsed at the lady with the baby, but they're having problems of their own, he continued truthfully, so I'm trying to help myself. Shiloh noticed the attendees watching amusingly, as if he were an attraction, an ad. This made him heat up with anxiety. That's wonderful, Please declared. Good for you, Shiloh. He squeezed and shook Shiloh's shoulder. What did you study in school? Marketing. Shiloh struggled with the delivery of his last answer, for he didn't want to come across as bragging. What next? Shiloh thought. The foods I eat? The files I keep? What if I told him I was into DeviantArt? Well, Please responded, that's a good skill to have. You think so? Shiloh replied directly. Absolutely. Have you been looking for work in that field? Yes, Shiloh said somewhat truthfully. Although he had applied for a few marketing-related positions, he had been primarily applying for hospitality-oriented jobs, for he felt, without a degree, he would have had a better chance at landing something that requires little to no skills or experience. But you know, he continued, it's a tough market out there. A lot of people are unemployed. No, want something that'll make them happy. Indeed. Have you thought about working for the church? I haven't, Shiloh thought. What would I do for a church? We have work like that here, Please resumed, and could use an ambitious go-getter like yourself. Shiloh smiled meekly. A delight had started to conquer the embarrassment. We also have a housing program. Housing program? Shiloh recalled Carlos's story of the church purchasing this building and turning it into a temporary housing facility. Was that the program to which Please was referring? Really? Shiloh said, intrigued. Can you tell me more about it? It's a bit too much to get into right now, but the program comes with resources that could help you get back into school. Shiloh watched the pastor look to his left and say, Is Shiloh's shelter manager here? Please had put his other hand over his charge's right shoulder. Shiloh found the man's touch oddly soothing, almost synesthetic, as if it came from his mother or another trusted figure. Funny how you think of your family during times like this, Shiloh thought. Present, Cedric announced. He was sitting a few chairs away from Carlos. Shiloh continued to think. Wonder if I'll ever see them again. Or if I'll ever be able to take a shower longer than the mandatory 2 minutes. Could you help Shiloh answer whatever questions he has? Of course. Several congregants applauded. Some guests followed. Shiloh was bewildered by the audience's sudden cheerfulness. A cheerfulness that didn't negate the hostility that had often permeated this room. After the applause ceased, Please said merrily, "That's what I like to see. People helping people." Shiloh smiled again, and just as he was about to step off the podium, Please asked the resolute young man, "Before you go, would you join me in a prayer?" Prayer? Shiloh thought. Shiloh attended a Presbyterian church as a child, and when the clergywoman spoke, he didn't produce images of life in Christ, but images of Christ in life. In the world, as a non-human entity with human elements, reacting to things physically as well as metaphysically. As a being, gracious enough to present indisputable evidence of the good or bad prayers people expressed. "Okay," he replied, stepping back into place. "What the hell?" Shiloh would have rather returned to the anonymity of his block, but this would at least keep his mind off of the time, and his bladder, which had started to fill up. "Excellent," Please said, his hands having returned to the lectern. "Just repeat after me. Oh God. Oh God." Shiloh watched the pastor raise his head and close his eyes. He then glanced at the audience, seeing that many others were closing their eyes or folding their hands. "I humbly ask for the invitation of your Holy Spirit." Shiloh emulated the followers' behavior, and almost stammering at first said, "I humbly ask for the invitation of your Holy Spirit. That it fills me with reverence, love, and understanding for God, myself, and others. That it fills me with reverence, love, and understanding for God." Shiloh couldn't remember the rest, but concluded the recitation with, "and others." He heard no sign of criticism. Please continued. "That it gives me the strength and courage to persevere. That it gives me the strength and courage to persevere." Well done. Just one more verse. Shiloh was feeling quite pleased with himself. "And that it deters me from all that is perishable and unholy. And that it deters me from all that is." That is. Shiloh remembered the proverb. The proverb, he knew, had nothing to do with him. "I'll say it, but I won't mean it. My God will understand. Nobody can tell the truth all the time. And that it deters me from that which is perishable and unholy." After a moment of uncertain silence, Shiloh heard Please say, "There." Shiloh took this as a sign to open his eyes. Worship ended a short time later. The attendees arose and, for the most part, moved out of the room. Some stuck around. A few complimented Shiloh. He, having been recently inundated with praise, thanked them. Shiloh looked for Cedric as he left the hotel's courtyard. He found the bulky, mustachioed man in the parking lot, standing and chatting with someone. Shiloh approached him, which took some courage. Upon contact, he asked Cedric if they could talk about the housing program tomorrow, after he rests. Cedric agreed and said, "Sorry about earlier tonight. You did good in there." Initially, Shiloh didn't know why Cedric was apologizing, but after a moment, the memory of the shelter and the log, like a plant in a bog, surfaced. "Thanks," Shiloh replied. "Don't worry about it. I just got lost in thought. I had a lot to think about, you know." The comparatively bulky straggler wrangler stood next to Cedric, smiling, observing. "Yeah," Cedric said, "I know. I was new here once too." The rest came out a bit more sternly. "We just have to keep an eye out for troublemakers." Shiloh began to understand Cedric's position. The shelter was a fearsome place, full of unpredictability and caution, but at least now the stares and whispers had a practical purpose. They weren't looking to attack people. They were looking to protect people. Shiloh expressed his understanding and went to join his cohorts. "Weren't you quite the little star tonight?" Carlos said, taking a draw on his half-smoked cigar. "Come on now," Shiloh replied modestly. Carlos blew from the corner of his mouth, away from Shiloh's face. "You don't think so?" "I just felt kinda weird," Shiloh said, up on stage in front of everybody. "I think I will talk to Cedric about the housing program, though. It's an opportunity. A way out, even if I don't convert. I mean, I could always leave if it doesn't work out." Shiloh wasn't too sure about that. It was a question he, later, wanted to ask Please and was planning to ask Cedric. If he left the program after entering it, would they allow him to re-enter the shelter if necessary? Was there a kind of contract involved? A compulsory belief in their God? They didn't allow people to re-enter services if they left in the middle of them. "What do you think?" he continued. "I think it wouldn't hurt to ask." Shiloh heard the distinct revving and rattling of the faded school bus. Others heard the bus too. It was coming to collect the Betts Street members. The guests, without direction, formed a line. Carlos, after having put his cigar out, lumbered toward the end of it. Shiloh followed, almost jumping at the sight of Fletch walking beside him. "Yo," Shiloh blurted, "where'd you come from?" "I didn't see you inside." "I decided to worship in my own way," Fletch said casually. Shiloh looked around. Cedric was several yards away, and Carlos was at least 5 feet ahead. "You stayed outside?" Shiloh said quietly. "Yep," Fletch replied, adopting Shiloh's tone. If Shiloh was less visible, he probably could have stayed outside too. It wasn't like anybody took attendance before or after worship commenced. "What did you do?" "Panhandle. Walked around. Explored the grounds. Overheard 2 guys argue about something." Unable to control his propensity for talking too much, Fletch added, "And man, the way they talked, you'd think they almost killed someone." Shiloh grabbed Fletch's wrist and said, "What did you say?" The door of the bus slid open, and the guests proceeded to board the vehicle. You know, their demeanor. It was all very intense and secretive. A lot of shushing and looking over the other's shoulder. The line had started moving forward. Cedric and the Wrangler also began moving. Shiloh was getting anxious again. What were they arguing about? Shiloh and Fletch, in keeping with the line, were about 13 feet from the door. Cedric was drawing closer. Sounded like one of them clobbered somebody. Shiloh wanted to know more, but Cedric was too close. So close, in fact, that he asked Shiloh if everything was okay. "Fine," Shiloh said. Cedric accepted that and moved to occupy one of the front seats. Shiloh occupied a space behind the seat Fletch had chosen. After the bus had started moving, Shiloh leaned over and whispered, "Do you know who it was?" Fletch had his head back, appearing tired. Nonetheless, the loquacious guest whispered, "Who what was?" "The one you said got clobbered." Fletch yawned. "I didn't get a name, but I heard something about somebody beating their kid." Shiloh knew of only one person who fit that description. An easygoing man whose repentance he witnessed only a couple of weeks ago. Arnie. Arnie was here. In the hotel. In the rehabilitation housing program. This has been The Legend of the Apartment Invaded and Praise by Angela Riteman and Anthony R. Wilbourne. Brought to you by Google. Book copyrights 2016 and 2024 from 1613 Productions. Audio copyright 2024. 5th audiobook edition, January 2026. All rights reserved. Other stories currently available from 1613 Productions include Faster Reacting Toys, The Hungry Man, and The Legend of the Gym Teacher. Thank you for listening.